Welcome back. Good to have you with us as well if we've just joined you. I'm Gareth Edwards. Oscar Pistorius will be evaluated as an outpatient at Westkopje Psychiatric Hospital. Judge Masipa has ordered that he be monitored every weekday for 30 days, starting on the 26th of May. That's next week, Monday, Karyn Maughan, if my calendar is correct. My maths is terrible, so I think it's next week, Monday as well. No surprise, though, from when we last spoke. Were you expecting it to be an outpatient order? Why is that significant?
In most instances with psychiatric evaluation, you're dealing with people who are accused of committing particularly horrific violent crimes. We see it a lot in particularly intimate femicide cases where spouses stand accused of killing their wives. Usually in those kind of circumstances, and this is what makes it significantly different, those people are not granted bail. For instance, Johan Kosa would be a case in point, the Mori monster. And so they're regarded as being potentially quite dangerous, and their sort of mental well-being is questionable. So the court in those sort of instances will not allow someone like that to be referred on an outpatient basis. They feel that it's very important that that person be constantly monitored, evaluated, and kept within the relative safety and confines of a psychiatric institution. Oscar Pistorius is in some ways a different situation. He is effectively accused of an intimate femicide, according to the state, the murder of his partner, Riva Steenkamp. But he was granted bail in a lower court, and certainly there's been no suggestion that he is, at this point, from the version of the state, a dangerous individual who needs to be protected from himself and society.
So let me put this to you then. I know that obviously everyone who's been following this case is probably following you on Twitter, and I saw questions being put to you earlier. Some people were asking me on Twitter as well. So let me ask you on air, is Oscar Pistorius getting preferential treatment?
I don't think so, because remember, Gareth, that his defense team were vehemently opposed to him being sent for psychiatric evaluation. They said it wasn't necessary. They believed that they could just bring in Dr. Merrill Forster's evidence as an expert witness and assist the court, as they put it, in understanding potentially Oscar Pistorius' behavior on that morning. Now, that may have been a somewhat naive decision on their part, particularly given that they are dealing with prosecutor Karyn Maughan, and he would certainly have seen, the beginnings of what he would have, has termed a potential diminished capacity defense. And so his behavior in response to that, I think, all the prosecutors that I've spoken to have said that they would have done exactly the same thing. But they were very opposed to it. Certainly, there wasn't wild enthusiasm from him about doing this. And I think you could certainly sense from his demeanor in court today that he's not happy about spending hours and hours in a psychiatric institution. In terms of special treatment, he is not taking a psychiatric bed from someone who's accused of a violent crime who will now be forced to stay in a prison environment, because he's not staying at the institution. So I don't know if that's necessarily fair criticism, but he has in some ways jumped the queue, and I think people would probably compound the outpatient status and the fact that he's gotten into one of these institutions relatively quickly and make judgments. Whether that's fair or not, I don't necessarily think so.
How does this play out? The various scenarios. Let's say, for example, we're going to fast track some 30, maybe 40 days to when the court begins again. And based on what the medical professionals come back with their, I imagine, collective reports on this, how does this play out for Oscar Pistorius? What are the two scenarios or more?
Well, basically what they've been charged with is under the Criminal Procedure Act and the Mental Health Care Act, essentially ascertaining whether at the time of the commission of the alleged offence he knew the difference between right and wrong, or potentially whether his ability to act on that awareness of right and wrong had somehow been compromised. In Oscar Pistorius' case, the question is far more nuanced, because there's no suggestion from his defense team that he was criminally insane when he shot and killed Riva Steenkamp. Their suggestion is, through the evidence of Merrill Forster, that because he suffers from a generalized anxiety disorder, his behavior on that morning may have been influenced by that disorder. So it would be a mechanism for them to explain, why did he just go charging forth, pump bullets through that door without ascertaining properly where Riva Steenkamp was, without making sure who was behind that door, the incredible and deadly force that he inflicted in shooting as he did. They may use that to explain this is a person who's fearful, highly anxious, believe he's constantly under attack, lives with a gun, is always afraid. And that would be a very useful mechanism for them. So they essentially would utilize it to argue to the court in the instance of culpable homicide and possibly as an explanation or counter to murder that this is a person who's not necessarily reasonable, cannot be judged by the standards of the reasonable man.
However, if we flip the coin over, what happens if it comes back and the reports suggest he is a reasonable man? There's no GAD or this general anxiety disorder, if you will. He's completely of sound mind. What does that do for him then?
I don't necessarily think, I'm not sure that they will not find that that diagnosis exists. I think it's going to be really a degree of whether or not it's relevant in these circumstances. Right. Dr. Meryl Forster is one of the former heads of Sterkfontein Mental Institution. She's highly regarded, and I would be quite surprised if her interpretation of her interviews with Oscar Pistorius and his family members was overturned. If that happens, the state may well have the mechanisms for arguing that he attempted to mislead the court, that he's in fact a perfectly sane individual. There are other aspects which may also, be problematic for him, in that we may see a scenario where the psychiatrist potentially, as Karyn Maughan suggested, argue that he has some kind of narcissistic personality disorder, or find unfavorable mechanisms in his behavior, which the state will then argue drove his conduct. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword. These all are incredibly astute professionals, and I think it's going to be incredibly interesting to see how they come back. And we wait to see exactly what does happen in just over 30 days' time. Karyn Maughan, for the moment, thank you very much. eNCA specialist report, find my tongue, Karyn Maughan joining us on Afternoon News. Expect a full report from her later in the evening.
Know more about your world.
eNCA.com